Good morning, everybody. Welcome to track 5. This is leadership in action, really success stories and lessons learned from CDOs. My name is Bob Audette. I'm a partner at Guidehouse and lead our data management practice in the firm. Really, today's session is going to be about uncovering the business value of data intelligence. And really, it's going to focus on a couple things. Data intelligence is really at the foundation of modern self-service analytics, growing a data culture, and driving data literacy. But the question is, how do we measure success? Is there a data culture ROI? How do you communicate the value to your different business stakeholders? So we're going to hear from Alation today. They've actually developed a metric framework and a value measurement process to really answer some of these key questions. And today's session is going to really introduce that approach and really review some specific real examples for each of you. A couple key logistical things. The session will be recorded. It will be available in the symposium proceedings, and usually I think that's available very shortly after the session. In addition, there will be video recording of the session, which should be available on the CDOIQ YouTube channel. And that'll be really 3 months after the symposium, so everyone should have access to that. The other thing for Q&A, really we're going to be, there will be Q&A, so definitely encourage those in the room, encourage those that are attending with the Whova app to please use the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring those questions and really, we'll see if we can address as many of those during the session. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, who's kind of behind me. John Willis is the field CTO of Alation. And in this role, he really focuses on strategic customer and partner advocacy, supporting strategic opportunities. Previously, he led the Alation Solution Development and Professional Services Organization. He's an author of the Alation's Book of Knowledge, and he has over 30+ years of experience in data management with several different startups and also with service providers. With great pleasure, I hope everyone enjoys the session. I will now pass it over to John.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it. I don't think I need this, right? I'm good? All right. Thank you very much, Bob. Appreciate that intro to the topic. I'm going to start the session with a question. It's a rhetorical question, but hopefully thought-provoking. The question is it cliche to say that data is a corporate asset? And now it's rhetorical because I'm sure everyone in this room says, no, it's not cliche. It's absolutely vital. But we say that a lot. We write about that a lot. But is data really ready to take its full seat at the table next to other corporate assets, such as facilities, human capital, raw materials, finished goods? Right? Is data really ready? What my assertion is that our challenge for all of us as leaders in the data space is to make it measurable, make the value of data as an asset measurable and quantifiable, right? And that's to help us with our credibility with business stakeholders and to also help us mature our discipline, right? And that's really the focus of this session, right? It's all about how do we go from just saying it's an asset to trying to take steps forward and to quantify and measure it, right? So that's really what we're focused on in uncovering the business value of data intelligence. And what I'm going to do is share where we've gone at Alation with trying to move that ball forward, right? So welcome and thank you for being here. I know it was a little bit of a challenge for me finding my way to the room, but I congratulate all of you for finding it and thank you all for being here. As Bob said, my name is John Wills. I will just give a brief, he's already done a great job of introducing me, but I will just touch on a few additional things. So I do hold several architecture certifications with some of these vendors who I've worked for at various points in my career. I do continue to develop methodologies and approaches for Alation. Prior to Alation, I was with a company called Calibra. 3.5 years, I helped them launch in the US, and I worked out in New York. had responsibility for everything post-sales. But I spent my entire career, 30+ years in data. So I've been deep in master data, deep in data quality, deep in reference data, deep in all things data essentially over that period of time. And it's not only just as leading technical teams, but it's leading doer teams as well, right? Large practices and consultancies who are having to work with leaders. The most fun I have in my role right now, just 2 other comments on me, and then we'll move into the topics I'm going to cover in the presentation. The most fun I have in my role, honestly, is interfacing with leaders like all of you, right? On a weekly basis, I have, that's a low estimate, 5 to 6 meetings a week with data leaders. And I learn probably far more than I could ever give back, but it's part of my role to try to give back and try to consolidate what I hear from all of you. Last thing I'd say is, although Alation is a Silicon Valley-based company, way out on the West Coast, I live about as far from Silicon Valley as you can imagine. I live in East Tennessee in a small town in the Smoky Mountains called Townsend. My 3 dogs, wife of 33 years, and the occasional bear that wanders through the property on at least a monthly basis. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's move into the topics that we're going to cover today. So I'm going to frame up and give a little bit of context for driving into the metric framework that we put together. So I'll provide 3 or 4 slides on context. I'm going to move really quickly through those. I thought it would be useful to give you, in fact, there's already a question online with someone asking about this, a quick survey of the value landscape, other work that's been done, some academic, some in the commercial world. So I'll give you a quick survey. Again, we're going to just go quickly over that. Then we'll move into the specifics, what we set out to build, our objectives and our goals, and then we'll get into the detail of the framework itself, and I'll detail out what I call sort of the 3 layers of the metric cake, how we put that together. We'll look at a couple of examples online, and then I'm going to round it out by talking about, or at least sharing some thoughts, and I'd love to hear from all of you what your ideas are, but where we'll take this next, right? Because I think we've just begun on this journey to develop a metric framework so we can, I love what one of the, I think it was David Spirk said in the keynote about being able to communicate value to the non-technical peers in the organization, right? And I think we've just started that journey, and I think what we're doing, I believe, is taking us in the right direction, okay? Just setting up context and framing out this topic, just to say, well, the business value of data and data intelligence, we're going to go attack that, and we're going to figure it all out. It's really squishy. It's really, really complex, right? It's highly dimensional, multi-dimensional problem. So what we've done is kind of break that down and say, okay, what the real driver behind that is culture. And now culture, if you say, well, I'm going to go out and measure data culture, that's kind of pretty squishy as well and pretty hard to get your arms around. So we subdivide that one more time into culture consists of being able to essentially have transparency in the first box, being able to find and understand what's inventoried out there, be able to apply critical thought and have all employees apply critical thought, so data literacy, and being able to trust and have confidence in the data through data governance. So we kind of subdivide it in that way to help us with our thought process about how do we approach a metric framework. So you'll see these 3 themes kind of played out as we get into the details of that metric framework later. The good news is, I think it's good news, we don't have to rely on just our own ideas about how to subdivide the world and think about it, because you all tell us what's important, right? Through reports like this Forrester report, which was surveying, it was an annual report of chief data officers and what things were important to them, what their priorities were. And way at the top is data-driven culture, right? And I would assert that the most important or highest priority item being data-driven culture, you have to be able to measure that, right? So I think we're all in the right room together, and I think it's kind of the right topic. And I would just point out that looking at this, on the right side where it says stakes are high and mistakes costly, we all hear about the numbers when bad things happen, and those are pretty concrete. They're fairly known. But we also hear about the benefits all the time, and I'd say the benefits are kind of why we're here. It's to get down to brass tacks and say, are these valid? I mean, where did these come from? You know, I mean, I am by no means trying to cast aspersions on industry analyst work by Forrester or Gartner or others. But, you know, some of these numbers, you just don't, I've read all these reports for years. Like, where did that come from? How do I take that to the boss to try to get more budget allocated or hire 4 or 5 more people, right, to work in the data space? It's really, really tough. So I think we're in the right room, and we're going to focus and drill down and try to, you know, bring some sanity and some meaning and reason to that. Just really quickly, we all know this. The pandemic just made this situation, you know, that much more urgent, right? It's if you're looking in the center, right, the changing workforce and like, where did all the people go? I don't know about you, but I'm like always wondering every day, like, where did all the people go? So there's fewer people to do this work. There's data doesn't stop, right? The explosion, we've already seen at this conference already, several statistics thrown out. And I don't know how closely you're paying attention to the compliance and regulatory compliance and what's happening, but there's an explosion going on there. There's 38 states that have individual bills in process through their legislature. There's a national bill that's working its way through. A lot of people say CCPA and GDPR. Those are only 2 of 25 international major pieces of you know, national law, right, that we're supposed to attest to. So it's you know, again, I think we're all in the right place, and these are the things that are driving us. Now, bringing it down to ground level, when I talk to leaders like yourselves, what they tell me is the reason they really need to measure the value of data intelligence it's because they need to get budget approval, very pragmatic things. Political support, we heard some of these things in the keynote already. They need to ensure alignment with corporate objectives, right? So attached to the important key strategic initiatives. They need to motivate their team and increase awareness of the role that data plays across the org. So these are very pragmatic reasons they tell me that they really wanted us to work on this problem, right? And so that's why we set out to do it. Now, I'll do a quick review of the landscape of other research that's been done around you know, frameworks or thought research around business value of data. I always love to look at information science and library science because it's such a mature discipline around managing and thinking about how to manage information, right? It's got sort of 100+ years on those of us in the data space. I mean, you know, who was it? Was it first mechanical printing press? It was Guggenheim? Am I getting that right? I feel like I've got that wrong. Back in the 1400s? I don't know if library and information science goes back that far, but it definitely goes back a lot further than what we've been doing in the data space. So there's a really great piece of work done by University of Illinois. This is the title of it, Measuring the Value of the Academic Library, Return on Investment and Other Value Measures, that I would point you towards. They're really doing a study to see if they can figure out an ROI formula. So that's a great piece of work. In the commercial space, specifically in the accounting world, you really don't find the research papers in the deep research studies, but what you do find are experts that are, you know, writing articles in journals like CPA Journal, where they're talking about, from an accounting perspective, how they're measuring the value of data. Most of them are talking these days about measuring data as an intangible asset, and then thinking of it almost like raw material, and then as that asset is turned into a report, a dashboard, a finished product, you know, they're converting it on the books. And there's a lot of interesting thinking going on around that right now. So I would encourage you to look at it from that dimension as well. Industry analysts, I've already mentioned Forrester with that first report. Gartner actually, and this was one of the questions online before we even started, which is around measurement of data literacy. This is a great piece of work. It's called How to Measure the Value of Data Literacy. I really like this paper from Gartner because they actually go into a process and a set of metrics, detailed metrics for measuring literacy. And so this is kind of I'm foreshadowing what I'm going to talk about, we're thinking of doing next. But this is actually something I'm probably going to lean on quite heavily in extending the work that I'm going to show you in just a few minutes. This next piece is actually from Intel Press. Intel Press, and these 2 books, there's a pair of books. This one is called Measuring the Business Value of Information Technology. And it really is dealing with, from a portfolio perspective, an IT portfolio perspective, how to measure the value of different aspects of that portfolio. So it's not data per se, but I think it's adjacent enough that it could be a quite useful work. I actually used this back when I ran a major consulting practice as part of HP for launching a new service offering called BI for the CIO. It's essentially BI reporting and analytics and value measures for CIOs. And this book was kind of the framework that we used for that. There's an association that's kind of small, but I think very worthy. I've tracked them for years. They're called IT Financial Management Association. The thing I like about this small group is it's really a set of experts, finance experts, and they continually take all their writings and they've collected them essentially into like a 9-volume series now. I bought the whole 9 volumes. It's like $600. Takes up literally this much room on your shelf. You could probably get it you could probably get it digitally now. But and you know, when I need a go-to source to flip through and look for how an adjacency of how finance looks at data, I often go to those books and see what they've written. They do cover things like chargeback. They cover things like activity-based costing. They cover all those finance things that you would expect. But there is an adjacency, a strong adjacency to the data world. And then there's other academic research. I just point this one out because this one's called Learning by Doing versus Learning by Viewing. This was an empirical study of data analyst productivity on a collaboration platform. It was done by Northwestern University and Cornell and Alation. So it was actually using the Alation data cataloging platform at eBay and testing whether productivity was going up and if you could measure the value of productivity going up. And spoiler alert, yes, you could measure it, and it was proven. And if you go pull that report and you read it, there's some pretty heavyweight mathematical formulas and work in there, which is pretty impressive. So I would point you to that as well. So those are just a few of the sources that I've looked at over time, that I've delved into to help think about this topic of measuring the business value of data. Now I'm going to move on and let's talk about more specifically what our goal and objective was for the work that I'm going to show you. The goal that I laid out for the organization was to create a prescriptive and measurable approach for both estimating and reporting on the business value that a catalog provides. Now that may seem like I just performed sort of like vendor ninja, I just kind of pulled the rug out from under your feet because I use that word catalog, and Alation is a leading catalog company. But I want to assure you this framework and these metrics can apply to any technology. So you may just want to say value a data catalog provides, or even rephrased again, metadata from your inventory data can provide, be another way to say that. The other thing I'd point out about that objective statement is that there's 2 pieces to it. We're saying estimating or forecasting value and then actually measuring actual value. So our goal was to be able to sit with people that haven't started yet and project out what the value could be, and then to measure actuals and look at that over time, right? Because if you don't have a target, then it's hard to know whether you're gaining on it or you're not gaining on it. The constraints we gave ourselves is it has to be empirical and quantifiable. The input has to be data-based, right? It can't be subjective. It has to reflect both business growth and risk mitigation. So you all know how much tension we all feel on that, right? The business wants to go fast. Everybody wants to go fast. But you have to control things. You have risk. And there's a tension there. It's, I would call it a healthy tension. But we wanted to represent both elements in the metric framework. And then it must use customer assumptions. And so point number 1 and number 3, when you combine it, it has to have empirical customer data or input, and it has to use customer assumptions. The overall theme of this was, it can't be us telling you what the value is. It has to be you telling you what your value is. You decide the assumptions. You turn the dials and knobs. You feed in the metadata about your data and how it's used in the enterprise. And what comes out of the model is your value, right? We did want to be in a position where, as a vendor, we're trying to dictate that, right? It's just not right. Doesn't make any sense. So I just want to clarify, right, when we say data catalog, and that this was part of our objective statement, what that really means. Well, the Alation catalog is a repository of metadata for information sources, which includes those three elements you saw when I talked about culture a few minutes ago. Finding and having transparency into what exists, knowing what's good, what good looks like, having confidence in the quality of what's out there, so that's governance, and being able to share that and socialize and collaborate around that. So it's metadata about those things, right? So it's not just metadata about a table, a column, the data type, the length of the column, but it's metadata about how people are socially interacting, what the quality and the governance of things are as well. So for us, that catalog contains a broad set of asset classes, right? What do I mean by that? Again, it's not just schemas, tables, columns, files, S3 file, yada, yada, looker files, microstrat files, for your reports. It's great. Those are, a lot of technical assets, but it also includes things like business terms, glossaries, metric descriptions, business process descriptions, regulatory requirements, on and on and on. So it's a network of asset classes or asset types that are related, which we want to use as part of the measurement process. So it essentially, if you look at the right, allows you to answer these core questions. How do I find the information that I need? Can it be used? Should it be used? How should it be used, right? Now, again, I'm going to assert to you that the framework and the metrics that I'm going to show you in just a minute can be applied if you capture and collect this from somewhere else, right? It does not have to be the Alation catalog. Obviously, it's going to be a lot easier if you're using Alation because you'll see how we extract it in a minute directly in, but you could collect it in other places. And this is really the one purely commercial slide that I've got in the deck. We are a leader in the space. We cover a number of use case areas with the catalog platform and our data intelligence platform. I'm just going to leave it at that. Track me down. I'll be here through Thursday. If you want more commercial information or who we work with and that sort of thing, be happy to do that at another time. So now let's get into what the value index framework and model is. We did call it a value index, but we had to put data catalog on the front of it because that's kind of who we are. So we called it the Data Catalog Value Index, DCVI. But it's called a value index because just like the S&P 500 or NASDAQ, it's a composite of a number of metrics, right? So we chose the word index. You'll see that in just a moment. So the Data Catalog Value Index, DCVI, is a metric framework and application. So we've also developed the application that uses the framework for estimating and measuring the value of a catalog implementation. This is just a mirror image of that slide I was showing you before. So it uses customer assumptions and metrics from their live Alation instance. It generates a simulation based on benchmarks for prospects, people that haven't started yet, because again, you're trying to project where your value, where you want it to go or what it should be. It produces interactive and PDF report output. So you could just take that PDF output with all its charts and graphs and its value measures and start using that in PowerPoints and internal communication. It provides a live connection to the catalog instance or an Alation query to extract that metadata that the model needs, right? So there's two different mechanisms that we use to pull that data out. Now what I could do is give you this analytic query, and you could just look at the structure of the metadata fields we pull in, and if you can pull that in from anywhere, a flat file, a spreadsheet, somewhere else, you can collect that, then you could still use the model. Go back a couple. This graphic on the right-hand side, unlike some graphics I use on some slides, it's not just gratuitous and there to make the slide look good. It actually, this kind of meaningful. This is, I mentioned early in the presentation that I was going to present kind of a 3 layers of the cake in the metric framework. And this represents the 3 layers in the cake. What we have is we generate a baseline catalog value, which is delivered by the catalog, by the collection and the management of your data assets, regardless of use case. And then we move up and we add value on top of that. So it's kind of baseline value, additive value on top of that for use cases. The 2 use cases that we've gone after to start with are analyst productivity and governance. And then the 3rd layer on the cake is customer, or you could say business function specific value that's based on a specific expected business outcome. Right? That's a 3rd layer in the cake. So now let's break those 3 down. Now we move into the eye chart, but I'll try to break this down for you and make it understandable. So the framework, the way we've set it up is we'll just go through each column from left to right. For the baseline, our drivers for the baseline is intrinsic data asset value. In other words, a belief that if you're managing data assets, and again, when I use that term data assets, I'm really thinking more broadly in terms of all these asset classes, right? Not just the data, but reports, your dashboards, your queries, your business terms, your metric descriptions. There's intrinsic value, and I'll show you where the assumption goes for the measurement of intrinsic value in just a second. There's intrinsic value in your assets and employee productivity. And so what we're collecting are counts of things like the number of data and reporting assets, and we're collecting up the number of search activity, this discovery and find activity. And what the assumptions we're using are around the cost of people, essentially, right? The people's time and the impact on their productivity. So we ask for kind of, for you to provide as an assumption, as an input, what your people costs are, and cost of employee time. So how much time would be saved if someone could find something, how much time in terms of them understanding it would be saved, right? Put those things in as assumptions. Then what we generate out for baseline values is an intrinsic inventory value, right? So a dollar value, a realized inventory value, search time saved, analysis and understanding time saved, and employee time value. Right? You'll see these in an example in a second. So that's the output. Now we move to the first use case column, which is analyst productivity. Our drivers here are the rank and file people who are using data in the enterprise, are they reusing the data? Is their productivity going up? Are they having a lot of social interaction and a lot of collaboration? Right? Those are our 3 drivers. So now we start to measure a different set of things, or sorry, collect metrics about a different number of things. We're collecting up the number of conversations. What is a conversation? Well, that's, if you think about a Slack threaded dialogue or a Teams threaded dialogue, or what people do in Facebook, that's what we do inside the catalog. We just call it a conversation. So it's an indicator of collaboration. It's an indicator of social interaction. So we collect that up. We're collecting up watches. So if somebody goes in and they start tagging certain assets, that's an indicator of interest, and they want to be notified when things change. So we collect those up. We collect flags. Flags are upvotes and downvotes on assets. So whether they like it, they don't like it, they see a problem. We're collecting up the number of published queries, and then what we call basic curation completeness. So basic curation completeness is essentially saying that there's been work that's been done on the naming of things and the description of things to improve their value, improve the ability for people to find those and use those. And again, we're looking at the assumptions are the cost of people's time, and then we compute the curation coverage percentage, query coverage percentage, and social coverage percentage, right? And these percentages, the reason they say percentages and not values is that these percentages are used to uplift the baseline value by those percentages, okay? And then the third column over, governance, our drivers are, is the data complete? Is it timely? Does it conform? Conform to what? Well, conform to our rules, conform to our policies, conform to our standards. So we're looking for the number of total assets that are complete that meet time requirements. So what does a time requirement mean? So let's take something like your rule is that whenever someone creates a dashboard and they inventory the dashboard, it has to have an owner indicated, not just an author, but an owner. Now, you might do that on data sets as well and all kinds of assets. And it has to be done within 15 days, right? So you give them a grace period. So we're counting the number of things that meet time requirements, conformance requirements, and completeness requirements. So again, we're generating out of this metrics for completeness percentage, conformance, and timeliness percentages, again, an uplift in value off the baseline. Because the idea here is that if you do nothing more than just inventory your data and give everybody the ability to find it, that's baseline value. If you do more than that, right, more than the basics, which is just to start creating some awareness and connecting people to each other to have conversations, to be able to watch things, maybe even to publish their own, their own assets, then you've added the value. And then if you do even more, which is to say we want this environment to be formalized, to be more, of higher quality, then you should get some bonus value for that as well. Does that make, yes?
So how do you assume the time saved per employee? How can we figure out what would be the time that they
Right.
use?
That's a great question. I'm not sure everyone online can hear, so I'll just repeat the question. The question was, how can we work out the assumption of how much time is saved? Did I roughly state that correctly, how much time is saved? We actually have a metrics assumption guide, and that we will sit down with an organization and walk them through how to think about the different assumptions, and then let them make that decision. Again, this is your assumptions and your data for your value. So we'll give you some guidance, but ultimately we'll let you and your team go away and decide, how you want to look at that, right? You could be very aggressive or very conservative with your assumptions. Yes, sir. Sure.
How do you really add the percentages to the time saved and the dollar value? Because you're adding the three and they're like apples and oranges being added together.
So,
Percentage plus time saved plus.
would you mind repeating it to the mic so they can hear?
How do you really add the three value tiers, right? Like you add percentages to time saved and then to some potentially financial value, right?
Right.
So how do you really add it together?
Well, we're taking the percentages and applying them against the baseline value, which is a dollar figure, which gives us a dollar figure, and then we can add them together, right? So we're using the percentages as a driver to figure out what percentage of the base value is an uplift. And what we've seen, we've run this model that I'm going to walk you through an example here on the next couple slides. We've run this model now for probably upwards of 60 of our customers at this point, and we're still learning. Like I said, this is a journey, but so far the feedback has been really excellent, and overall they felt like their ability to control the assumptions is allowing them to reflect what they believe and they're willing to attest to within their organization. Yes, sir.
So what about intrinsic inventory value versus realized, or unrealized versus realized? Can you comment or describe a little bit more about the intrinsic or unrealized and what that means?
Yeah, and basically intrinsic, and let me just flip to the next slide and I'll, maybe this will make it easier. So there's an assumption about midway down through the slide here, intrinsic value per catalog asset, and you can see that it's 2 cents. So what we're saying basically with intrinsic is that we believe there is some value for what the assets you're managing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be managing them. They would be jettisoned. They would be archived. They'd be gone. So we believe that there's that's what we call intrinsic value. Now, if you thought we were just full of it and you make that 0, right? That's your decision. We think there is, so we've given you an assumption to slot it in. We usually make this very, very small, like 2 cents per asset or 1 cent per asset or something like that. Now, when we say realized value, that's essentially when someone has, it just doesn't sit there, but the asset has been searched for and there's been some level of consumption of it, right? Okay. Yes.
I was just curious how you defined an asset. So are you talking like an application is an asset, or is it down to a data set level and user computing tool or model? How do you define an asset here?
Yeah, good question. So again, we have, I think in terms of asset types, asset classes, if you will. And that includes, I'll just give you a whole list, right? So a metric description is one asset. So if you have a whole glossary full of 1,000 metrics, that's, it's 1,000 assets. If you, have terms and you have 5,000 terms in a glossary or across 10 glossaries, it's 5,000 assets. If you have a query, that's an asset. So a table, so a data source, say a Redshift data source with 5 schemas, and each schema has, 1,000 tables. And 1,000 tables each have on average 10 columns. You do multiplication on all of that, and you got a whole bunch of assets, right? So it's down to the column level. So does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. So this is a quick peek at the assumption model, and again, we've got a PDF that written up that we hand to people and walk them through to explain what these are. So that normally they need to go away and think about them with their team. We basically, at that customer stage, the second one down, early, mid, or late, this kind of feeds into our benchmarking, where we're for people that start with nothing, right? We can ask them kind of what they project their growth rate to be. I won't get into that. Then we have average hourly employee rate. We talked about intrinsic value, consumption value per asset view. Average time saved per search. So this consumption value asset view, I guess we called that realized value before. So I kind of switched up the semantics on you. Sorry about that, but that's kind of that realized value. Then we get into the big long poles in the tent. The long poles in the tent are the average time saved per search and the average analyst or comprehensive time per search. These are usually, where you're saying, okay, a person is going to save 3 hours by being able to find this asset because it's inventory. And if it's, they're also going to be able to save 2 or 3 hours of comprehension time, right, per asset. We all hear about the metrics of how much time is spent trying to find and understand data as opposed to actually working with it. This goes after that directly and attacks that. Bob, did you have a question?
I did have a question. I guess who's the primary audience for these metrics? Because they're pretty detailed, and I'm curious as to who is that audience and what type of action are they really trying to take related to these metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the audience, and believe it or not, we've had CDOs that have sat in some of these meetings. Although the details, right, they kind of leave it up to their people to work through the details of the assumptions, but they're really trying to use it as justification, right, for their, for their data program, and what business value, right. So I'd say it is ultimately for the CDO to try to strengthen their case internally. Now, working through the details, my observation is it is usually their core team members, but they're having internal discussions offline without us about. With those leaders about what these assumptions should be. So. All right. How are we doing on time? Okay, excellent. So there's 2 different collection mechanisms. I've talked about those earlier. I'm not going to get into the detail. One is we give you a query and you pull it. The other is we do a direct connection. The very first thing you see once you connect through the DCVI application is you see the total number of assets. Going back to your question, the largest count is always going to be columns. That's always going to be the most voluminous asset type that you have. But then, if you're in the Alation catalog, you see things like compose executions. We have the ability to publish and execute queries within the catalog. So you see compose executions, you see published queries, flags I mentioned earlier, which is that upvote, downvote, @mention, so people can @mention assets anywhere in the catalog, so it represents a relationship and a related interest. Articles are what turn into terms and metric descriptions. So those conversations, schemas, and so forth. So you get this count and you get this time series. It's really interesting about the time series. This is kind of an aside from value per se. What's really interesting about the time series is you really can tell, it's kind of like layers in the sandstone, and you can definitely tell how an organization is doing with adoption just by looking at the time series and the volumetrics themselves. You can really see spikes. Sometimes, like when you have a real jagged spike here in April, that's an automated load. You know, they've gone through and they've done an overnight automated load of some data assets, and they've jumped up their asset count. What you see when you have a smoother curve is you have adoption and usage by individuals, and it's more organic growth. They're adding things as they're working inside the catalog. What I mean by adding things? Well, they're adding in their own queries, maybe their term descriptions. They're maybe augmenting descriptions of things that exist, titles, making those better for their colleagues and so forth. So the very first thing we do is we get a count, and then we have all the value measurements and the dollar amounts that are produced. So you essentially have this breakdown of total value in the pie chart, and you could see in the large blue area, this is comprehension time saved. And the orange is search time saved. So these are always the two big elements of value, basically based on human productivity, people's productivity. You have the three boxes: baseline value, analyst productivity value, and governance value. Under baseline value, you have a dollar amount for comprehension time saved, search time, intrinsic value of the inventory, and realized value of the inventory. You're adding on top of these numbers, so reflecting the social interaction, collaboration, time saved by publishing queries, basic curation coverage, and social coverage. So, for instance, if you see that baseline value is very high, but you have a proportionally very low analyst productivity, right? What does that tell you, right? It almost immediately tells you you've been doing a lot of inventorying of assets, but you really don't have much engagement in terms of adoption and engagement across employee population where they're actively using it. There's very, very low social interaction. And then you have the value of governance use case. And again, additive dollar amounts. These are all based on those percentages that we generate. So you don't see the percentages here, but the percentages generate. I mean, there's other tables where we show those in the app, but you don't, on this slide, you don't see the percentages. You just see the dollar amount that was applied to the baseline. Yes?
So how do you get the dollar figures to support the calculation here? So you have very specific dollar values here. And then the data is going to be used by a variety, very broad, different topics and use cases. So how do you tie those different use cases to the actual dollar value here? Because I understand CDOs want to make a case, but that case needs to be trustworthy. So how can they justify the dollars that's showing on?
Yeah, great question. First of all, remember where we're at in the framework here. We're on layer 1 and 2 of the 3-layer cake, right? So we're at baseline value and first stage use case value for analyst productivity and governance. We still have to talk about business outcome value. So we'll talk about that in a slide or two. But all of these dollar amounts are backed up by the calculations in the formula. We produce that and provide it in a PDF as well. So right, the team can fully go through all the formulas themselves and make sure that they understand. If they need to explain them, they can explain them, or just that they feel good about it, that it all holds water. Now, how they get to this dollar amount or these dollar amounts, you put in assumptions for your people cost. You know how many searches, for instance, they've been executing on. You know what your intrinsic value of an individual asset is. So taking all these counts of these things and multiplying them out by people cost and time is where these numbers come from. Yes, sir.
Because by seeing these numbers, here we can total like $2.5 million. And I can imagine myself showing this in my company and being told, okay, and where are those $1.5 million on my bottom line? And they probably aren't. So it's hard to, we are measuring productivity, but as a term of effectiveness. But the problem is that when we try to do so, our business counterparts or the CFO could say, but the company is doing right. So we are making the same decisions. We as CDOs try to, we are sure that we are improving the quality of the decisions that the business areas are doing on top of better and faster information. But I guess that the hardest challenge is how to measure that different outcome from making decisions with faster and better data and than what it could have been done without that data. But in terms of effectiveness, I could see a very easy resistance to these numbers from a financial point of view.
So what we've experienced in talking to people like yourself, you said that's not surprising because we've heard that. What some CDOs will choose to do is have their team work with the assumptions to get their assumptions to were very conservative. So the numbers end up being, wherever they feel comfortable with them, but more conservative, right? So something they feel like they can justify. That's my first comment. The second comment is, this is, when we first started communicating this, I think we were miscommunicating that this was savings. And, people started saying, well, what do you mean? For $3 million in savings? Well, show me that, right? Where is it? Because, so I think what we had to change in terms of our communication was this is productivity improvement, right? This isn't savings. It's not like you got $3 million more in your budget. Well, we've also had CDOs who say, you know what, maybe I'm not going to present these right now in terms of dollar figures. And some of the other charts and graphs we have that I was talking about before that show time series, in fact, let me go forward and, where they show growth and they take a slice of this and they start communicating that internally, like the social interaction and the growth of their data culture by demonstrating some of these things. So they've taken different slices of this to communicate value in the way they think they can sell it internally, right? So we have seen some of that. So, and I think that's all fair. And I think this is also part of what we need to work out as we go to the next phase of this, kind of a framework or a model. And we need to keep thinking about this, right? How do we make it more real and easier to communicate, right? So let's just talk about extending the framework a little bit. So we talked about the first two layers of the cake. Now the third layer of the cake, customer-specific value, business outcome value, right? This is the trickiest one of all. And in fact, we haven't automated this. And I, frankly, I don't know if it's automatable, but we're still thinking about it. This is where you want to align and enforce a relationship with your, with core strategic initiatives and demonstrate a contribution to key business outcomes of a key business stakeholder. So you want to take a specific process as part of the business, and you want to say for that process, applying data results in a certain positive or more optimized outcome, right? The trick here is that like it says in the title, the business stakeholder has to be willing to partner with you on that and attest to that. It all comes down to their attestation, right? That they're saying, yes, I worked with them. The assumptions are correct. The formula is correct. And if they do all these things each quarter, that equates to this value, right? It all comes down to that. So the way that we think about it is that you should start by doing the first 2 layers of the cake the way I've described already, and then look for a business stakeholder. And I loved it in the keynote. One of the gentlemen made a statement similar to this, or maybe I was seeing it through my own lens, but is that you move across the organization. He didn't use the word domain or function, but essentially I was thinking he was moving across the organization and proving success. So you have to find a stakeholder, prove success, and then report and socialize those outcomes, and then build on top of it. So essentially, you've got the first 2 layers of the cake, and then you're adding that value, business outcome value. Now, we have a spreadsheet. It's a little bit of an eye test, I know, but you can use your own spreadsheet. But we have a spreadsheet where what we do is we have the functional benefits. These are functional benefits to finance, marketing, production, operations, whatever department. And we sit down with that leader who's willing to work on value, come up with a key metric that is going to be used to report the value, and then tease out the specific assumptions and the formula that's going to be used. Basically, it's a contract between us as data people and them as a functional business leader to say, as I stated before, if we do all these things, you're going to attest to the value that we've helped you optimize in the business. And so we use this spreadsheet to kind of document all those and then collect up those benefits. And it would add it on top of the first 2 layers of that framework cake. And I believe that for the gentleman here in the front, I think maybe this gets a little closer to what your question you were asking about, speaking to the specific business value of a business leader or a functional leader. Okay. So where do we go from here? There's a whole bunch of things that we're thinking about, right? Areas we could provide value, and I am sharing this as much to get feedback from all of you, if not in this session, because we're probably going to run out of time, but at the rest of the conference, I'd love to have any conversations you have about these to get your feedback. But these are, I think, interesting possibilities of where we take this framework next. So just to run through these. So perhaps we can find value in the reduction of cycle time for resolving data issues. And if we can propose to resolve those more quickly, we can assign some value to that, perhaps. I love this idea of including value measurement around literacy and these literacy metrics. So I really am going to take that Gartner report I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to take a deep look at that to see if we can incorporate and bolt that in. So now what you can say is, well, if you go across the enterprise and you have an annual literacy program, you have ongoing awareness, training, and you're doing that for the employee population, maybe you can measure and account for that as value. So we'll see where that goes. I think this automated, this using models for prediction and next action recommendations, it seems to me that if we are optimizing the business, we ought to be able to account for that and prove the uplift and the value off of that. So I'd like to see where that goes. This is kind of a negative value, but there's a lot of assets in our data garages and data basements that we're just dragging along year after year. We all like to get rid of it. It seems like if we can get rid of it, maybe that's a case for assigning a value to the fact that we just are getting rid of it. There's this idea, I mentioned earlier that risk and compliance wrapped around, mostly around privacy, is just exploding. So it seems to me like identifying the gap between policies that state what people are supposed to be doing and then monitoring and measuring what they're actually doing, and the gap there or the uplift off of that might be a ripe opportunity. And then, the world right now, I don't know if you all are feeling it, but so many conversations I'm having now are about data mesh, data products. Everybody's going data product orientation. And so it seems to me if the world really is going to a data product orientation, and that's what we're delivering now as data people, that when we set up the semantics around that and sort of the agreed contract of what goes into a data product, what's on the tin, the label on the tin, right, how it reads, why don't we have on that same label the value that we are going to account for when you consume this data product, right? It seems to kind of be a pretty natural fit. So we're going to see where that goes as well. All right, we are about out of time. I had hoped to reserve some time for questions, but we had great questions along the way, so that's great. Do we have 1 or 2 minutes left, or how are we doing?
Yeah, we have about 3 more minutes.
Okay, let's see if there's any other questions, and then
there is an online question, which I think is an interesting one. I'm not sure that we can really say that we know the numbers of searches for data happening right now. Mm-hmm. In absence of a single data catalog and a single place people can search for data. So does this framework assume a certain level of maturity in data documentation?
The framework really does not assume a certain level of maturity. For those of you that aren't catalog users and don't have all of your assets inventoried, what I can offer is that our benchmarks that we have, we could offer you the benchmarks, and you can look at those and think about how they apply to your environment, even though you don't have the automation in place for the search. And maybe you could play with those a little bit and even maybe go more conservative on how many searches you think are happening. It's really interesting debate. When we put some of these things in front of teams, you'll have a couple of people on the team going, oh, no, we don't do that. Like, nobody searches. And somebody else in the room will stand up and be like, are you crazy? Like, this is all everyone does all day long. And so it's a really interesting, even to watch the internal debates happen. So more than happy to work with whoever asked the question and try to provide whatever assistance we can.
I think we have room for maybe one additional question. How does data ethics fit into this framework that you've described, if at all?
Well, that's a great question. Data ethics, that is a great question. We haven't really thought much about how it fits in this framework yet. But that's a very thought-provoking question. I really appreciate that question. I'm going to have to think about it a lot now. But no, it doesn't really fit in yet. Okay. Is that it for the questions? So let me just wrap. I started by asking a rhetorical question, right? Is it a cliche to say data is an asset? And I laid out a challenge that we have to come to a point, if we're maturing our profession, that we can measure these things and quantify these things. We've taken a stab at starting on that journey. We're quite excited about it. Look forward to working with all of you. Hope you enjoyed it. Think you got something out of it. I look forward to talking with all of you through the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.